chosen one. 7 dreams God uses to speak to you at night. He slept like someone running from the day. It's like someone who could no longer bear the noise of the world or the questions that never knew where to land. He was not special, at least that's what he believed. His name was Caleb, living in a quiet village at the foot of the mountains, with calloused hands from labor and silence as his most faithful companion. Caleb had made routine his refuge. He never got involved in trouble, never chased answers, and above all, he never asked questions. To him, dreams were nothing more than that fragments of a tired mind. Till that night, it was winter, the kind of night when even the tree branches seemed to sleep. The wind was soft, and the fire in the hearth crackled like a grandmother telling old stories. Caleb closed his eyes slowly, letting go of the world like someone removing their shoes before entering a sanctuary. But something was different. Moments into sleep, he felt, not saw, not heard, but felt that he was no longer alone. There was a presence there, soft like the sound of falling snow, but deep like a mother's gaze upon a newborn child. It was as if someone was waiting for him at the threshold of his unconscious, hands gently extended. But Caleb didn't ask who it was, because Caleb never asked, not even in dreams. That night, the dream had no colors. It was all shades of light and shadow. There was an old stone staircase spiraling up toward the heavens. No one was guiding him, but somehow there was a certainty in the air. This was not the mind's invention. It was a calling. Caleb awoke with damp eyes, his heart beating like a ceremonial drum. But, true to his nature, he said nothing, not even to himself. He got dressed like he always did and walked into another ordinary day, trying to ignore what was awakening inside him. But the dream returned. Not the next night, nor the one after, but it came back. And when it did, it brought questions. The very questions he had spent his life avoiding. In the village, people spoke of him in soft tones. He's a good man, they'd say, hardworking, honest, but too quiet. Caleb was known for listening more than speaking, for helping without being asked, for being present and yet always somewhere far away. But no one knew there was a war inside him, because when he closed his eyes, the dreams pulled him into realms that felt more real than the world around him. And slowly, the dreams began to speak to him, not with words, but with symbols, images that left footprints on his soul like tracks on wet sand. One morning, Caleb stood still in the middle of the field. He looked up at the sky, and for the first time, he dared to wonder, what if this isn't just a dream? It was a timid thought, barely a whisper from within, but in that very moment, a breeze brushed his face, and the scent of jasmine filled the air. Even though no flowers bloomed nearby, even though it was winter, and Caleb knew he wasn't imagining, he was being called. That night, the second dream came. He was in an empty room, white walls, absolute silence. But there was a sound, as if silence itself was preparing to speak. In the center of the room stood a chair, and on the chair a mirror, but the mirror was covered. Caleb approached, and as he reached out to lift the cloth, a voice, not from outside, but from deep within, whispered, "Don't ask what's hidden. Ask why you never wanted to see." He woke with a knot in his throat, and for the first time, he felt fear. The next dreams weren't just images. They were experiences, moments that felt more vivid than any waking memory. And strangely, they brought peace, even when they didn't make sense. Even when they left him unsettled, Caleb began to write, to document every detail, because he feared forgetting, and at the same time, feared remembering. The pages piled up, filled with drawings of doors, stars, staircases, hands, weeping eyes, mirrors, silent storms, and faceless voices. And a pattern emerged. Each dream shared one thing in common. God was trying to speak, but in a language only the soul could hear, not the mind. He went to see the village elder, a wise man with a white beard and eyes that seemed to look beyond time. Caleb sat in silence, as he always did, but this time he asked, "Sir, is it possible for God to speak while we sleep?" The elder didn't smile, didn't flinch. He simply replied, "Not only is it possible, my son, sometimes it's the only time he can be heard." That night, Caleb slept like someone who had finally accepted an invitation. And the dream that followed was the clearest of them all. Man dressed in simple robes, his face hidden by light, extended a scroll toward him at the top. It read, 7 dreams, 7 keys, 7 signs for the ones chosen in their sleep. Okay, beneath it, the first key, the dream of the unseen stairway, when God shows you a path no one else can lead you to but him. Caleb awoke with his eyes open wide, but something within him was still asleep. And yet, something else had just begun to awaken. In the chapters to come, Caleb will be guided through each of the 7 dreams, not as someone chasing answers, as someone finally willing to ask the right questions. And you? Have you ever wondered why certain dreams keep returning? Perhaps you too were chosen. And God is simply waiting for the moment when you allow yourself to truly listen. The whispered dreams began. The night didn't fall that evening. It descended like a velvet curtain drawn slowly over the stage of the world, preparing something sacred, something that demanded silence, the kind of silence that holds its breath, waiting. Caleb sat near the fire, but it was not warmth. Sought, it was understanding, a sense that all those dreams, those signs, those strange echoes in his sleep were not madness. He had begun to feel it in his bones. Someone was calling him by name, not the name others used, not Caleb the quiet one or Caleb the farmer, but the name only God knows. The village slept. Even the wind held still. And as he closed his eyes, Caleb whispered, for the first time in years, "If it's really you, show me." He didn't know who he was speaking to, only that something in his chest, something ancient, something sacred, had asked for this moment. And as he drifted into sleep, the second dream began. But this one didn't start with symbols. It started with sound. At first, it was faint, like wind between leaves, then softer, like a child's breath near your ear. Words, but not in a language he had ever spoken. And yet, he understood. It was a language of meaning, not of form. A vibration that moved through his chest and settled behind his eyes. He was walking through a field made of stars. The ground sparkled underfoot like crushed diamonds. The sky, it was not above him, but around him. He was inside a dream. That was dreaming him back. That's when the whispers grew louder. They were not commands, not instructions, but reminders. "You asked," they said. "You opened the door. Now, do you remember why you closed it?" Caleb didn't answer, but in his dream, his hands began to tremble, and from his palms, sand began to fall, golden sand, falling endlessly, like time slipping through memory. Suddenly, he stood before a vast wall. Carved into it were thousands of names, each glowing with a different color, as if lit from within. He searched for his, not with his eyes, but with his soul. And there it was, not Caleb, but a sound older than language. A name that had no letters, only light. The moment he saw it, the whispers stopped. Silence returned. But this time, it was not empty. It was full of everything he had forgotten, full of everything he had been afraid to remember. In the dream, he reached out and touched a name on the wall, and a warmth spread through his chest, not like fire, like the memory of fire, comforting, gentle, uninjurable. Then a figure appeared beside him, a woman cloaked in white. Her face was hidden by a veil of feathers. but her presence was unmistakable. She spoke with no mouth. "You are one of them," she said. "One of the dream bearers. The watchers of the night. The ones God speaks to when the world stops listening." Caleb wanted to speak a T, but in that realm, only truth was allowed, and truth isn't always ready to be voiced. So he listened. She held out a scroll. It unrolled in midair, revealing a symbol at the top, an eye inside a flame. Beneath it, a single line, "Dream to the voice without a face." And below that, more. When the divine speaks, it doesn't always use words. It uses recognition. It speaks through tears you don't understand, through people who vanish after changing you, through a voice you feel, not hear. Caleb wept. He didn't know why. Like that some part of him had waited his whole life to be told that he wasn't crazy, that the dreams weren't just dreams. They were messages, encoded, timeless, sacred, and he had been chosen to receive them. The woman stepped closer. She lifted her hand, and where her fingers passed, the stars rearranged. They formed an image. A boy kneeling by a bed, praying, alone, but in the shadow. Behind the boy stood a figure of light, watching, listening, waiting. The woman whispered, "God never forgets those who speak to him when no one else is watching." And then she was gone. Caleb awoke with a single phrase echoing in his chest. "You are seen." Even in silence, he looked around his simple home. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. The air felt thicker, the light through the window more golden. His heart beat slower, steadier, like it was syncing with something ancient. He looked at the paper where he'd been writing down his dreams. And for the first time, he titled the page before writing anything else. Night 2, the voice without a face. And underneath, he wrote, "If you wake with tears, you were heard." That day, Caleb did not speak, but his silence was different. It wasn't avoidance, it was reverence, like someone who had seen something too sacred to explain. The villagers still greeted him kindly, still saw him as the quiet one, but none of them knew that he now carried a voice inside him that wasn't his. The message that came wrapped in whispers, stars, and scrolls. And that night, he would dream again. Not because he asked, but because when you've been chosen, the dreams don't stop until the mission begins. The stairway that wasn't built by hands. The third night didn't begin with sleep. It began with surrender. Caleb no longer resisted the mystery, no longer tried to explain the unexplainable. He simply prepared, not as someone hoping to dream, but as someone ready to remember. Because something deep inside him had awakened, and now it refused to close its eyes again. He placed the paper and pen beside his bed, lit a small candle, not out of superstition, but as a gesture, soft flame to welcome whatever divine presence might return again. He didn't pray. He didn't ask, he just whispered, "I'm here." The dream began in silence, not the silence of nothing, but the silence that precedes music. A held breath in the universe. Caleb stood at the edge of a field. Not a field of grass, but of light. Each blade shimmered like liquid gold, and yet made no sound when touched. Ahead of him, something impossible unfolded. A staircase, suspended in the air, without supports, without beginning or end. It curved not upward, but inward, to something unseen, something sacred. The steps were made of stone, but not earthly stone. Each one shimmered with ancient markings, etched not by tools, but by intention. And as Caleb placed his foot on the first step, he felt it. He was not climbing into the sky. He was climbing into himself. With every step, memories surfaced. Not memories of this life, but echoes of something older, a lifetime he didn't recognize, but which remembered him. He climbed slowly, not out of fear, but out of reverence. Each step pulsed with a question. Are you ready to rise above what once held you? Can you leave behind what no longer serves you? Do you trust what you cannot see? He answered with silence. And the silence became permission. Halfway up, the stairway shifted. Not in direction, but in substance. The stone turned to light, and yet it held his weight. Because in that place, weight was not about gravity. It was about truth. Only what was true could ascend, and Caleb knew this was not a dream for entertainment. It was a revelation. Each step was a letting go, each breath a remembering. He paused, not from exhaustion, but because something waited for him at that step. He looked to the side and saw a window suspended in midair. Through it, he could see his own life. Moments from his childhood, lonely meals, tears cried in silence, questions never spoken, and beside each scene, a soft glow, a presence, watching always there, even when he thought he was alone. Caleb knelt, not in sadness, but in gratitude. He whispered, I didn't know you were with me. Even then, the light from the stair beneath him grew brighter, as if the staircase approved. The voice came again, not like before, not a whisper. This time, it was within him. This is the stairway that no one else can build for you. You rise by remembrance. You ascend by release. He understood the staircase wasn't external. It was made of all the truths he had refused to carry, all the forgiveness he had denied himself, all the divine whispers he had once mistaken for noise. Each one had become a step, and now he was walking on what he once ignored. At the top of the staircase, there was no door, only light, and inside that light, a table, and on that table, a book bound in white, edges glowing. No title. He approached, and as he opened the book, he saw something that made him weep. Every dream he had ever forgotten was written there. Every symbol, every fragment, every moment he had dismissed as nonsense, recorded in sacred ink. And at the very bottom of the page, written in gold, you are the dream I planted in myself. Now, you remember. Caleb closed the book, not because it was finished, but because he was not. He looked around. The light shimmered, and from within it, a voice, no longer faceless, no longer hidden, spoke. When I cannot speak to your mind, I speak to your soul. And when your soul forgets, I speak in dreams. The voice paused, then whispered, you are ready for the fourth. Caleb awoke, not with a start, but with stillness, like someone who had just returned from a temple built in the stars. He sat in silence for a long while, then picked up his pen and wrote, Night 3, the stairway that wasn't built by hands. Tonight, I climbed into myself. I saw what I had buried. I heard what I had silenced, and I realized God does not build staircases with wood. He builds them with the parts of us that are ready to rise. That day, Caleb didn't speak to anyone, but those who saw him noticed something. There was a light in his eyes, a calm in his steps, and even though he said no words, people felt as if he had spoken directly to their hearts. Because when someone begins to carry heaven inside them, the world can't help but notice. The dreams were no longer dreams. They were callings, initiations, sacred conversations between the Creator and the created. And Caleb was listening. The storm that waited for you to calm it. It came on a night of thunder, the kind that rumbles deep in the earth before it touches the sky. But Caleb wasn't afraid. Not anymore. He had come to expect it, that strange pull in his chest before the dream arrived. The sense that the veil between two worlds was lifting again. It's just enough for him to pass through. This time, there was no slow descent into sleep, no fading into darkness. He closed his eyes and opened them in another world. He was standing on water, the surface of a great ocean, dark as ink and stretching beyond sight. But he didn't sink. His feet rested gently, as if the sea had agreed to hold him above him. The sky churned. Clouds moved like thoughts across a tormented mind. Lightning crackled in pulses, not striking, but waiting. The wind howled like a forgotten voice trying to be remembered. And in the distance, a shape, a storm, not just weather, but a presence. It wasn't chasing him, it was waiting for him. Caleb took a step forward. The water rippled, but did not resist. Each movement felt intentional, as if the dream was allowing him to choose. He had this sudden realization. This storm wasn't here to harm him. It was here to ask him a question. As he approached, the winds grew louder, not violent, but desperate, like a child crying in a language only the soul could understand. The clouds parted, not upward, but outward, revealing a single, massive eye in the sky, not threatening, not angry, just watching. And from its center, a voice that thundered without sound. Will you fight the storm or listen to it? Most would have run, tried to wake, begged for escape. But Caleb stood his ground, and then he whispered, I hear you. In that moment, everything stopped. The waves calmed. The wind died, and the eye closed, but not in rejection, in peace. The storm had been waiting, not to be defeated, but to be acknowledged. The clouds turned to mist. The lightning faded into soft glows, and the water beneath Caleb's feet became as still as glass. He looked down and saw himself, but not his body. He saw every fear he'd ever carried, every word he never said, every pain he had inherited and mistaken as his own. They floated around him like petals on a still lake, and the voice returned, softer now. You cannot calm the storm in the world until you calm the storm within. Caleb closed his eyes, placed his hand on his chest, began to breathe. With every breath, a fear dissolved. With every heartbeat, a wound closed. He wasn't controlling the storm. He was becoming still enough to let it release itself. Then the sky opened. A light descended, warm, steady, inviting inside it. A scroll, the same kind as before. It floated toward him and unfolded midair. This time, the title glowed in blue. Dream 4, the storm that waited for you to calm it. And beneath it, some dreams are not visions, they are mirrors. They show you what you fear, not to torment, but to teach you that fear only grows in silence. And silence breaks when you choose to face it. Caleb wept. Not out of sadness, but relief, because the storm had never been against him. It had always been part of him, a part that longed to be loved, to be held, to be heard. He opened his hands, and the light poured into them like water. When he looked again, the sea was gone. He stood on solid ground, not in the dream world, but waking life. It was morning. Soft light spilled through the window. Birds sang like nothing had happened, but everything had. He rose slowly, like someone who had just returned from a battle he didn't know he was fighting. He picked up his pen dot and wrote, Night 4, the storm that waited for me to calm it. The greatest storms don't come to destroy. They come to remind you of what you've avoided. Not every loud thing is violent. Sometimes it's just your soul asking to be seen. He paused, then added, God doesn't only speak in peace. It's the times he speaks through thunder, because he knows that's the only way we'll look up. Caleb left his home that day with a new kind of silence. Not avoidance, not retreat, but the kind of silence that listens. To wind, to birds, to his own heart, and most of all, to the dreams that weren't done with him yet. It's to be continued in part 5, The Empty Room That Spoke. Deseja, QEU, continue, agora.com, a part 5. Vocadis, continuo, ChatGPT dis, perfetto. Vamoscontinuer.com, a proxima part, Da Jornada de Caleb, chosen one. 7 dreams God uses to speak to you at night, part 5, The Empty Room That Spoke. Sometimes what speaks the loudest is the space between words. Caleb had begun to notice the quiet, not just the absence of noise, but the presence of something deeper. As if the universe had been whispering all along, and he was only now learning how to hear. He no longer feared the dreams. He welcomed them, because each night now felt like stepping through a hidden door. And behind that door, more of himself was waiting. This night was no different, and yet everything was different, cause tonight he would meet the emptiness. The dream began in a corridor, long, endless, made of soft, pulsing white stone that felt almost alive. His footsteps made no sound. The air was thick, like a cathedral holding its breath. He walked with no sense of time, no urgency, just trust, until he reached it. A single door, wooden, worn, with no handle. But it opened as he approached, not by force, but by invitation. And what lay beyond was nothing, an empty room. No windows, no furniture, no symbols, no voice, just silence, but not cold, not hollow, alive. Caleb stepped inside. The door closed gently behind him, and he stood there, waiting, listening. At first, he felt foolish, then uncomfortable, then still. Then, in that stillness, something opened, not around him, within. It started with a memory. He was 5 years old, sitting alone in a dark closet, hiding from a shouting match he didn't understand. His knees pulled to his chest, tears silent, heart racing. He had forgotten this moment, but the room hadn't. This was not just a dream, it was a chamber of echoes. Everything he had buried was still alive here, waiting for him, not to punish, but to reveal. Then came the second memory, older now, 15, looking in the mirror after hearing someone say, "He'll never be enough," believing it. He saw his own eyes, then hollow, guarded, not because of what he had done, but because of what he had accepted as truth. The empty room whispered, "You still carry the versions of yourself that never felt seen." And the silence grew heavy. He fell to his knees, not from weakness, but from knowing he couldn't carry it all anymore. He placed his palms on the ground. The floor pulsed, and the room spoke, but not with sound, grieved with knowing. Every part of him that had ever felt unloved, every dream he had abandoned, every fear he had mistaken as identity, the room showed it all, held it all, and then said, "Do you want to let go now?" Caleb didn't answer with words. He just cried, in a way he hadn't cried since childhood. Not loudly, but deeply, like the soul's version of exhale. And as the tears touched the ground, they didn't vanish. They bloomed. Each tear became a small light, floating upward, like tiny lanterns rising into an unseen sky. And from their glow, the scroll appeared. It floated toward him, unrolling with the grace of forgiveness. At the top, Dream 5, the empty room that spoke, and beneath, the emptiness isn't empty. It's where the voices go when they're not ready to speak. It's where truth waits for silence, and where healing begins when you finally stop performing. He reached for the scroll. It melted into his hands, and he felt warmth spread through his chest. Not excitement, not joy, but peace. It's a kind that only comes when you stop running. Stood. The room no longer felt empty. It felt full of everything he had tried to forget, and now could finally forgive. He opened his eyes. Back in his bed, the candle still burning beside him. But something had changed. The air around him no longer felt heavy. It felt light. He reached for his journal. Ken wrote, "Night 5, the empty room that spoke tonight. I didn't hear words. I heard silence. And in that silence, found the version of me I'd left behind." He paused, then added, "Some dreams don't show you angels. They show you yourself before the world told you who to be. Caleb walked outside. The moon hung full in the sky, and for the first time in years, he looked up and smiled. Because everything was fixed, but because now he knew where to listen. Not to noise, not even to answers, but to the stillness that speaks when your soul is finally ready to hear. The mirror that refused to reflect. There are nights when the dream waits for you, and there are nights when you wait for the dream. This was one of those. Caleb laid in silence for a long time before sleep finally arrived. Not because he was restless, but because something inside him already knew. The next dream wouldn't come to comfort, it would come to confront. And yet, he welcomed it, because now he no longer feared what he might see. He feared what he might still be ignoring the moment the dream opened. He recognized the space. It was a room made of mirrors, walls, floor, ceiling, all reflective, but not glass. The surfaces shimmered like liquid silver, slightly shifting with his breath. It was beautiful and unsettling, because something was off. Caleb couldn't see himself. He stood in the center, but his reflection was missing. Everywhere he looked, there was light, movement, surroundings, but not him. And that's when the unease set in. Because it's one thing to not recognize who you've become. It's another to realize the world reflects everything except you. He walked slowly. Each mirror remained blank where his figure should have been. And in that absence, questions began to rise. Who have you become when you're not trying to be seen? Okay. What parts of you have you silenced just to be accepted? Which truths did you trade for love that wasn't real? The questions didn't echo. They sank straight into his chest like stones dropped in deep water. Then came the first flash. A mirror shimmered, and suddenly it showed something. Not Caleb, but a version of him, dressed in clothes he once wore, smiling a smile he once practiced, performing a life that had earned him approval. But not peace. The image faded. Then another appeared. This time, a version of him who said yes when he meant no, who laughed when he wanted to cry, who gave everything and never asked for anything back. That mirror shattered without sound. Only light. He fell to his knees, not in pain, but in exhaustion, because now he understood the mirrors weren't broken. It was fragmented pieces of himself scattered through versions he had created to survive. Masks he wore so well, even the reflections forgot what lay beneath. And as he knelt, the room began to shift. The mirrors curved inward, moving like petals closing in, drawing him to the center. And in the heart of the room stood a single mirror, framed in gold, untouched. Waiting, he stood, walked toward it, and as he approached, still a reflection, until he whispered, "Show me who I am when no one is watching." The mirror pulsed, and then it didn't show a face, It showed light, a soft, glowing essence, shimmering, expanding, pure. It was not male or female, not young or old. It had no features, but it had truth, and he recognized it, not with his eyes, but with his soul. This was him, before the world, before fear, before pretending. The mirror hadn't refused to reflect him. It had waited for the real him to arrive. The scroll appeared, floating gently beside the mirror. It unrolled itself with the grace of silence. At the top, Dream 6, the mirror that refused to reflect, and below, not every mirror lies. It's more simply waiting for you to stop lying to yourself. They do not show the masks. They show what remains after every mask falls. Caleb reached toward the mirror, placed his palm on its surface, and felt warmth, like hands holding his heart. Like the embrace of someone who never left, even when forgotten. He whispered, I remember. The room faded, not like a scene ending, but like something fulfilled. He woke before dawn, his eyes open. The candle beside him had burned low, but still flickered. Like it, too, had waited all night to witness what happened. He turned to his journal and with a calm hand wrote, Night 6. The mirror that refused to reflect. Sometimes it's not about being seen, it's about being found. Sometimes the person you're searching for is the one who stopped searching long ago. He paused, then added, God doesn't reveal your soul in mirrors made by men. He reveals it in the reflections that only dreams can hold. That morning, Caleb walked past his own mirror. He didn't look into it because for the first time, he no longer needed a reflection to know who he was. He had seen it, he had felt it, and he would never forget again. The stranger who knew your name. Some dreams feel like stories you're writing. Others feel like memories returning home. This night was neither. It felt like an appointment, one that had been set long before Caleb was born. He didn't fight sleep. He welcomed it, not as escape, but as entrance, because part of him already knew. Tonight, he wouldn't meet himself. Tonight would meet someone who remembered what he had forgotten. The dream began in a marketplace, ancient, vibrant. Banners fluttered above cobbled streets. Lamps hung from ropes swayed gently in the breeze. The air smelled of spices, wind, and stories. People moved around him, faces blurred, voices soft, not because they were hiding, but because they didn't matter. They were background to the moment about to unfold. And then he saw him, a man sitting at a wooden table, plain clothes, calm demeanor. It's like deep wells, in a posture that felt like he had been waiting forever. Caleb froze. He had never seen this man before, and yet he had. The man gestured. A silent invitation. Caleb walked over, heart beating faster. He sat before either spoke. The man smiled, not politely, but knowingly, then said, You've taken the long road, but you've always been walking toward this table. Caleb's voice trembled. Do I know you? The man tilted his head, then replied, You knew me before you knew how to ask that question. A silence passed between them, not awkward, sacred. Then the man spoke again. You've dreamed of doors. You've seen storms, climbed stairs that bend inward, faced silence, faced your own eyes. You're not asleep, Caleb. You're remembering. Caleb's chest tightened. How do you know my name? The man didn't answer. Instead, he slid something across the table. A letter, worn, sealed with a deep blue wax, marked with the shape of a tree whose roots reached upward. Caleb broke the seal, unfolded the letter. Inside, blank, at first. But then, letters began to appear, written in his own handwriting. It wasn't a message from the man. It was a message from himself, from a part of him that had written it long ago and sent it. Forward in time, the letter read, If you're reading this, it means you made it to the 7th dream. You've remembered enough to hear me again. This stranger is not a stranger. He's the voice you silenced when you began to fit in. He's the guide you pushed away when you stopped trusting. He is you before the world convinced you otherwise. Caleb dropped the letter. Tears stung his eyes. He looked up, and the man across the table had changed. Same body, same clothes, but now his own face stared back at him. Older, wiser, unburdened, and that version of himself smiled with no shame, no judgment, only deep, patient love. You weren't lost, the older Caleb said. You were just interrupted. Then, are you ready to remember why you were chosen? Caleb nodded, couldn't speak. The dream shifted, not ending, just opening wider. The marketplace faded, and in the soft glow of twilight, the scroll appeared, hovering between them. This time, both versions of Caleb reached for it, together, at the top. Dream 7, the stranger, who knew your name, and below, Sometimes the one you're searching for in dreams is the version of you that never gave up. The one who kept the name God gave you when the world gave you too many to carry. Caleb embraced his older self, not like a goodbye, but like a merging. And in that moment, all the scattered pieces of who he had been came back together, not to make him perfect, but to make him whole. He awoke before dawn, eyes wide, chest open, hands trembling. He didn't reach for the journal, and he didn't need to, because this dream was now a part of him. But still, he wrote, Night 7, the stranger who knew my name, I met myself tonight. Not the me I show, not the me I explain, but the me God never stopped waiting for. He paused, then whispered, I'm coming home. Outside, the world remained quiet. But inside, Caleb, the storm had calmed. The silence had spoken. The mirror had cleared. And the name had been remembered. He was no longer just a dreamer. He was a man on holy ground. The door only opens from the inside. Some doors don't appear until you're ready to walk through them. And even then, they don't open from the outside. Caleb didn't sleep that night expecting a dream. He slept with a knowing that the dream had already been waiting for him long before his eyes closed. Because now the questions had changed. They weren't about understanding the dreams. They were about remembering who he had always been within them. This time, the dream didn't begin with a place. It began with a feeling, a warmth in his chest, a pulling behind his ribs, as if something buried was finally rising to the surface, not as pain, but as permission. And when he opened his eyes inside the dream, he was standing before a door, plain, wooden, without a handle, without hinges, without keyhole. And yet, he knew it was his, not because it looked familiar, but because it felt like home. A strange silence hovered in the air, not empty, not threatening, just sacred. He stepped forward. There was an inscription on the door. No language, no letters, just a symbol, a heart encircled by light and locked from within. And the moment Caleb reached out to touch it, the voice came. You've tried to open this door before, but only from the outside. He closed his eyes and remembered all the times he had searched for purpose in places that never saw him. All the moments he tried to earn what could only be awakened. All the doors that stayed shut because he hadn't yet believed he was already inside. The dream didn't speak in riddles anymore. It spoke in reversals. The door pulsed, alive, and the voice returned, not from around him, but within. This is the door to calling, to truth, to the version of you that remembers why your soul chose this path. And it does not open by force. It opens by agreement. Caleb placed his hand on the symbol and whispered, I'm ready to remember. A soft hum filled the air, like the sky itself was holding its breath. And then, nothing happened. Not at first, because the door didn't open outwards. It opened inward, into him, and what lay on the other side was not another realm, not a temple, not a guide. It was a room made of memory. He stepped inside and was surrounded by moments, some his, some older, some that felt like echoes from ancestors he never met, but whose prayers had formed the steps beneath his feet. In one corner, the first time he forgave someone who never said sorry. In another, the moment he decided to stay alive. Further still, a memory of a childhood dream to help people, even if he didn't know how the room was him. Not the surface him, but the eternal one, the soul-version, and in the center, a small flame. He approached the flame. It did not burn. It glowed, soft, alive, familiar, and beside it, a scroll, curled gently like it had been waiting in peace. As he reached for it, the voice said, every soul has a door like this, but most wait for someone else to open it. And so, it stays closed. It's not because it's locked, but because it needs you to say, I'm ready. Caleb opened the scroll at the top. Dream 8, the door that only opens from the inside. And below, the moment you stop begging the world to let you in, you realize the calling has always been waiting inside you. This door does not ask for credentials, right? It asks for permission, yours. He closed his eyes, let the truth sink into his bones like roots into soil. And as he did, the room dissolved into light, not vanished, merged, because the space beyond the door had never been somewhere else. It had always been him. He awoke with tears on his cheeks, not from sorrow, from homecoming. He reached for his journal, but this time he didn't just write. He prayed as he wrote. Night 8, the door that only opens from the inside. Tonight, I stopped asking for access and realized I was the only one who could give it. He paused, then added, the world may lock you out, but the soul is always unlocked from the moment you finally ask it to remember. Caleb sat in stillness until morning. He didn't need a new dream. He was still living inside the last one, because the real doorway was never about sleep. It was about awakening. When you wake, crying, and don't know why. Some mornings begin with tears you can't explain, not from sadness, not from pain, but from something deeper, something you barely have words for. Caleb knew that kind of morning. He had just opened his eyes. The candle had long since burned out. The air was still, gentle, full of invisible presence. And there they were, tears on his cheeks, a wet pillow, a trembling chest. No nightmare, no memory, just the ache of something wholly brushing past his soul. And he whispered, I don't know why I'm crying, but I know something just left me or entered me. That night, the dream didn't wait. It took him the moment he closed his eyes. There was no imagery this time, no room, no staircase, no stranger, just sound, a song, old like wind through ancient trees, like the lullaby the stars must have heard when they were first born. It wasn't sung in words, but his soul knew it, and it hurt in a way that felt like healing. Then came the feeling, like being held, not by arms, not by any figure, but by presence, the way the ocean holds a boat, the way silence holds a confession, the way God holds everything we've forgotten. And in that feeling came the tears. In the dream, he wept, but not because he was broken. He wept because something buried inside him was finally being seen. The voice came again, but this time sounded like his mother's voice, then his grandfather's, then his own, because the divine wasn't speaking as someone else. It was speaking through everything that had ever loved him, even when he didn't recognize it. And the voice said, these tears are not sadness. They are your soul remembering what it was before fear, before noise, before trying to earn what was always yours. The dream shifted. He stood in a field at dawn. Grass was wet. The air was gold, and children ran barefoot, laughing without reason. Joy with no story, no permission needed. He watched them, then heard one of them call out, come back. Hi, looked around. No one else reacted, just him. And again, the voice of the child, softer now, come back to where you left yourself behind. Caleb fell to his knees because he remembered not the whole story, but the moment he started to become someone else. The first time he dimmed his own light. The first time he felt too much. The first time he told himself, be smaller, be quiet, be safe. And that forgotten child, the one who danced without shame, was still waiting in that field. He reached out, and for a moment, the child ran into his arms, and Caleb held himself, literally, spiritually, eternally, and the two versions merged into one. The tears didn't stop. But now, they were not sorrow. They were truth leaving the body. Grief that had waited a lifetime to be loved. Joy that had been trapped in silence. The scroll appeared beside a single flower in the field. This one, smaller, simpler, but more sacred than any before. He unrolled it with shaking hands at the top. It's Dream 9, when you wake crying and don't know why. And beneath, the soul has a memory, and sometimes it speaks through tears, not because it's in pain, but because it's been seen. It remembers what it lost before the mind was old enough to grieve it. He stood again. The sun in the dream began to rise, and in its light, the voice returned one last time. Every tear has a route, and when it falls, something blooms beneath you. Caleb woke in peace, but the tears still came, not from sorrow, from recognition. And in his journal, he wrote, Night 9, when you wake crying and don't know why, I held myself tonight. It's not the man I am, but the child I left behind. When I wept, it wasn't because I was hurting. It was because I had been found. He placed the pen down, pressed his hand against his chest, and whispered, I remember you now. If you're safe to come home. To dreams that return until you. Listen, some dreams come once, like a visitor. Others return like a knocking, soft at first, then louder, then unignorable. Caleb had started to notice the patterns. Some of his dreams had changed him once, others were changing him still. They returned, not because he didn't understand, but because there was more to receive. Because dreams from the divine aren't measured in how strange they seem. They're measured in how deeply they echo, even when you're awake. This dream began in a place he had already been. The staircase, the stars, the mirror, the door. But this time, they were all there at once, not in confusion, but in completion. As if the realms he traveled, one per night, were never separate. They were pieces of a greater truth, now stitched together, like light through stained glass. He stood at the center of it all, and the dreams began to replay. Not as memories, as messages layered, deeper than before. And that's when he realized each dream didn't just happen once. Each had always been calling, waiting for him to turn back and say, I'm listening now. He stood before the same room of silence, only this time it was filled with echoes of moments he had ignored, people he had dismissed, emotions he had numbed, all repeating, not to punish, but to give him another chance to hear, because some dreams are kind enough to come back. He saw the storm again, but this time he walked straight into it, not to calm it, but to dance with it. He stood in the mirror room and didn't cry. He smiled, 'cause the reflection stayed. He saw the child in the field again, this time not alone. Now there were others, children of all ages, all forms, fragments of himself he had forgotten, each carrying something he once loved. For the world convinced him to let go. He wept again, but with joy. And then the man from the marketplace appeared again, his older self. He sat beside Caleb without speaking. They watched the dreams swirl together, and the man said, it was never about decoding them. It was about letting them change the way you move through the waking world. Caleb nodded, because he understood the dreams weren't just messages, they were training, each one stretching the soul, softening the shell, preparing him to carry something the world couldn't give, but desperately needed: stillness, depth, light. The final scroll floated between them, brighter than all the others. It unfolded in a spiral, wrapping around Caleb like a cloak. At the top, Dream 10, the dreams that return until you listen, and beneath, the most important dreams come back. Okay. Not because you failed to hear, but because part of you still wants to remember. Every return is a kindness. Okay. Every repetition, a sacred second chance. The older version of Caleb looked at him and asked, are you ready to live in a way that makes remembering unnecessary? Caleb closed his eyes, took a breath that felt like the first dot, and whispered, yes. He awoke, but this time, there were no tears, no shock, no racing heartbeat, just peace. The kind that doesn't ask for more. The kind that knows you finally said yes to your own soul. In his journal, he wrote, Night 10, the dreams that return until you listen. They didn't repeat because I was wrong. They repeated because God is patient. Because grace doesn't knock once and leave. It waits and whispers, I'll come back when you're ready. And Caleb was ready, not just to dream again, but to live. As one who remembers the dream that felt more real than life. There are dreams you wake up from, and there are dreams you wake into. Caleb had reached a point where the boundary between sleep and wakefulness no longer felt like a line. It felt like a door. A door he could cross in either direction, not to escape reality, but to remember the one that was always there beneath it. Because now, something had shifted. The dream didn't feel like a place he visited. It felt like home in the waking world. It's like a mirror that only reflected half the truth. That night, sleep didn't take him. He stepped into it, with eyes closed, but senses wide open. Caleb walked across a threshold that felt sacred. There was no flash, no scene, no sound, just an unfolding, like reality turning itself inside out. And he realized he wasn't in a dream anymore. He was in the origin, the place from which all other dreams were born. The place that shaped him long before he had a name. Long before time had a clock. He stood in a landscape made of light and memory, not solid, not fluid, but alive. There were no people, and yet he was not alone. The presence was everywhere. Not watching him, being him. He felt every cell in his body singing, not with music, but with meaning. Every breath was a message, every blink a revelation, every heartbeat a language of its own. This wasn't imagination. This was more real than anything he had ever touched in waking life. Then, a shape emerged, not from above, but from within the light. A figure, feminine and masculine at once. No age, no race, only essence. It approached, and Caleb didn't speak, because he knew what this was. Not a guide, not an angel, not a version of himself, but the voice of the Creator, clothed in familiarity. And the figure said, You've walked far, not across distance, across layers of forgetting, and now you are ready. Caleb bowed, not out of fear, but out of recognition. And the voice continued, This is not a lesson. This is a remembering. Before you were born into form, you stood in this very space and agreed to forget long enough to remember on behalf of others. His tears streamed down his face, because something in those words broke open what was left of his doubt. He had always wondered why the pain had been so sharp, why the silence had lasted so long, why the dreams had felt more like awakenings than fantasy. And now he knew he had chosen it, not as punishment, but as purpose. The voice lifted a hand, and the space around them turned, not spinning, but opening, revealing a memory not of Caleb's past, but of his soul's origin. He saw himself, pure light, dancing in a garden made of stars, surrounded by others, each glowing, laughing, weaving dreams into the fabric of time. And he remembered, this was the moment he said yes, yes to being born, yes to forgetting, yes to one day returning to this space, having survived the journey. The voice spoke again. This dream is not a message. It is a reward for every time you stayed, when it would have been easier to leave, for every time you listened, even when you weren't sure if it was real, for every time you opened your heart, even though it had been broken. And then, softly, you are home, but you're not done, because now you carry this reality back into the waking world, not to teach, but to remind. Caleb nodded. He looked down at his own hands. They glowed, not with power, with peace, the peace of someone who no longer needs to prove or explain, only to embody. And the scroll appeared, made not of parchment, but of breath, of energy, of love. It wrapped around his body like a robe, and the words wrote themselves across his skin. Keem, Dream 11, the dream that felt more real than life. And within, this is not a dream. This is the memory of your divine beginning. You are not here to chase God. You are here to remember that God was never outside you. Caleb opened his eyes, but for the first time, he didn't feel like he had awakened. He felt like the dream had come with him, because now everything felt holy. The air, the ground, the breath between thoughts, the strangers walking past. Nothing was ordinary anymore. He wrote slowly that morning. Night 11, the dream. It felt more real than life. I stood in the place I came from, and I saw the version of me who never forgot. Now, I carry that memory into everything I touch. Hint, one final line. Waking life is not the opposite of dreaming. It is the invitation to live as if the dream is true. Caleb closed the journal, and for the first time in his life, he didn't feel like someone who had been chosen. He felt like someone who would agree, and that made all the difference. When God speaks in someone else's dream about you, not all dreams come to you. Some arrive through the hearts of others, and when they do, it means you're no longer just walking your path. You become part of someone else's awakening. That morning, Caleb received a knock at the door. Unusual, uninvited, but not unwelcome. It was Elijah, the quiet shepherd from the edge of the village, a man of few words and fewer visits. But today, he looked different. His eyes held something ancient, like he had traveled far, even though his feet were dusty from the same soil they'd always known. He stood at Caleb's threshold and said, "Only this. I had a dream about you." They sat in silence for a long time. Caleb offered tea. Elijah declined. The dream, it seemed, was still pressing on his chest, still too heavy to carrying casual conversation. Finally, Elijah spoke. "You were standing in fire, but you didn't burn. Your eyes were closed, but light was pouring out from your mouth. And behind you, there were thousands listening, silent, but not afraid." Caleb said nothing, because the dream was not foreign. He had seen glimpses of it, felt the heat of that flame in his bones, but never shared it. And now, here it was, not in his own dream, but in someone else's. Elijah continued, "I tried to speak, but I couldn't. And then I heard a voice. It wasn't yours. It wasn't mine. Said, 'You cannot guide what you haven't yet faced. Plead now.' He has faced it." Caleb closed his eyes. He could feel it again. That holy fire, the one that didn't burn flesh, but burned away falsehood. He looked at Elijah and whispered, "Why do you think you saw it?" Elijah's hands trembled. "Because I've been asking questions. I think God answered them through you." And in that moment, Caleb understood. The dream wasn't about him. It was about what was being born through him. Because once the soul remembers who it is, it becomes a signal, a mirror, okay? And others begin to dream about you, not as a person, but as a message. That night, Caleb didn't sleep with expectation. He slept in intercession, because he knew the journey was no longer his alone. Now, others were walking it too, and some didn't even know they had begun. So he dreamed on their behalf. The dream that came was quiet. A garden, a bench, and one by one, people appeared. Some he knew. Most he deemed single quotes. Each sat beside him, a tea, not to ask, not to speak, but to be still, to share a silence that could hold everything they'd never been able to say aloud. And above them, a great tree, its branches woven with threads of light, each leaf a whisper, each root a promise. And Caleb understood he had become the tree, rooted, silent, unmoving, but available. The scroll appeared, not as paper this time, but as a woven strand from one of the branches, it wrapped around his wrist and glowed with a pulse that felt like memory at the center. Dream 12. When God speaks in someone else's dream about you and woven through it, you are no longer just a dreamer. You are the answer to a prayer someone else is afraid to pray. When your soul awakens, it becomes a voice that others begin to hear even while they sleep. He awoke just before sunrise. Outside, the sky was beginning to glow, but inside, he was already lit. He reached for the journal and wrote slowly, Night 12. When God speaks in someone else's dream about you today, I saw myself through someone else's night, and for the first time, realized that I'm no longer just remembering for me. I'm remembering so that others can begin. He closed the journal, walked outside barefoot, and stood in the soil as if planting himself, because now he was no longer just waking up. He was being grown, and that was the most sacred dream of all. The night you asked, and the sky answered. There are prayers you speak aloud. There are questions you whisper into your pillow. And then there are moments, quiet, sacred, in between, when you ask something not with words, but with your entire soul, and the sky listens. Caleb stood beneath the stars that night, not to admire them, but to ask them something they had witnessed long before his body was formed. He looked up, barefoot, breath steady, and whispered, not with his mouth, but with the ache behind his ribs. Why me? Not from ego, not from fear, but from humility, because now he could feel it, that something bigger than him had been whispering all along, calling him, trusting him. And though he had walked the path, he still didn't know why he had been chosen to remember, to dream, to carry something invisible. So he asked, softly, sincerely, and the sky answered, not with thunder, not with stars falling, but with a dream, one so gentle. It felt like being wrapped in the first breath of creation. He stood in a place made of dusk and dawn at once, a sky both rising and setting, a place without time, and before him, a single chair, not grand, not golden, just true. He sat, and in front of him, a figure of light formed from smoke, drifting into shape like a memory returning home. It sat across from him and asked, why not you? Caleb couldn't answer at first. Tears, W-E-L-L, the figure continued. You think you were chosen because you're strong, because you're good, because you're wise. Shook its head. No, you were chosen because you were soft enough to listen. The words broke something inside him, but gently, like releasing a dove from a cage. Then the sky around them shifted. Images poured across it like constellations waking up. He saw the faces of people he had helped without realizing it. A child who copied his smile in the market. A woman who walked away from despair after hearing one quiet word from him. A man who chose to live another day because Caleb had seen him when no one else did. And then the faces faded, replaced by a mirror, and in it, Caleb saw himself, but not how he imagined, not how others saw. He saw the thread, the line that had stretched across his entire life, pulling him gently through every moment, every loss, every silence, every impossible survival. And the voice said, you were never chosen to be loud. You were chosen to be still, so others could find the quiet where I speak. Caleb fell to his knees, not from shame, not from awe, but from knowing, from belonging, because now he saw a pattern. He hadn't missed the signs. He was the sign, a living message. The scroll appeared above his head, unfolding slowly like the sky itself was reading it aloud. At the top, Dream 13, the night you asked, and the sky answered, and beneath you were chosen, not because of your strength, but because of your softness. You asked, and the sky didn't hesitate, because the sky has been waiting for you to listen to your own heartbeat. He awoke before dawn, the stars still overhead, but now Ka. They looked different. They didn't seem far away. They felt familiar, like eyes that had always been watching. Not in judgment, but in love. He sat down to write. Night 13, the night I asked, and the sky answered. I wasn't answered with reasons. I was answered with recognition. I am not strong. I am available. I am not loud. I am listening. And that was all God ever asked of me. He didn't cry this time. He smiled and whispered to the stars, "Thank you for waiting. You were chosen while you slept. Now what?" It's one thing to be called. It's another to answer. But it's something entirely different, Adia. As someone who did, Caleb had walked through dreams as if crossing ancient thresholds. Each night, a door. Each silence, a voice. Each tear, a message wrapped in light. But now the dreams had quieted, not because they ended, because they had done their part, and the question left behind was simple and terrifying. Now what? He sat on the same bench where his father once carved wood, where his mother once braided herbs, where Caleb once watched the world without knowing what it would ask of him. He had been faithful to the silence. He had listened to what most ignore, and now he could feel it, the shift, deep, gentle pressure of something awakening in the daylight, not in visions, not in dreams, but in the ordinary. A child passed by, limping slightly, and Caleb noticed not just the limp, but the story in it, the weight carried behind the eyes, the quiet ache in the way he looked at the ground. And Caleb didn't turn away. He called the boy over, asked his name, sat with him in silence, then handed him a small carved bird, one he had made years ago. No sermon, no prophecy, just presence. The boy smiled for the first time in weeks, and Caleb felt it. Not glory, not power, but alignment. He was beginning to live from the place the dreams had led him to. That night, there was no dream, and yet he slept with a sense of purpose deeper than any scroll, because he no longer needed messages. He had become one. The next morning, he walked through the village, and people felt it, not because he said anything, but because something unspoken moved with him. Some called it peace. Some called it mystery. But the ones who needed it most called it permission. Permission to slow down, to feel, to listen. Because when one soul dares to remember, it gives everyone around them a reason to believe they can too. Later that day, as the sun touched the hills, Caleb stood outside his home, eyes closed, his breath slow, and he felt it. The dream was no longer something he had, it was something he was. And the voice, the one that had visited him in symbols and silence, spoke just once more. From within, you were chosen while you slept, but you are confirmed when you walk. The dream ends where the living begins. Now go and become the prayer I planted in you. A scroll, glowing in the sky like twilight script, shimmered in his vision, not in sleep, but in spirit. He smiled at the top. Dream 14, you were chosen while you slept. Now what? And beneath, the dream is not a destination. It is the birthplace of movement. You were never meant to stay in the silence. You are meant to become its voice in the noise. You do not carry a message. You are the message unfolding. He picked up his journal one last time for the night and wrote, Night 14, you were chosen while you slept. Now what? I asked for signs. I was given remembrance. I asked for clarity. I was given stillness. Asked for dreams. And now I live them. He paused, then added, there is no final dream. Only the moment you realize you are already living inside the answer. And as the stars began to rise behind him, he didn't look up. He looked within, because the map was already written on his heart. The completion, what was whispered to you, was never meant to stay quiet. Every whisper from the divine carries within it a future echo. It's not given to remain still. It's given to move, to find breath in another, to become voice through you. For Caleb had walked the path of dreams. He had faced the stairway, the storm, the mirror, the silence, the child, the flame. And now, there were no more messages, because the message had become him. And what was once whispered in symbols, in silence, in sleep, was now ready to be spoken through his life. He no longer needed a journal. Not because the journey was over, but because the ink had already become blood. The truths had been written in his bones. And now, they would live through every choice, every pause, every act of unseen love. That morning, he walked through the market, not as a man with answers, but as a man with presence. People greeted him differently, not with curiosity, but with trust, as if they could feel something without needing to name it. 'Cause some awakenings don't shine, they soften, and softness, when sacred, makes others feel safe enough to open. That afternoon, a woman approached him, one he had never met, eyes wide, voice trembling. She said, "I dreamed about you. You were standing in a field of silence, and somehow I remembered how to forgive my father." He didn't speak. He only placed a hand over his heart, 'cause he understood. The dream had never been just for him. It was planted in him to grow through others, and now it was blooming. That night, as he sat beneath the stars, Caleb felt no need to look up. He felt them within, not as distant light, but as memory. He whispered softly, but not to ask to release, "I will not keep what you gave me. I will not bury what was breathed into me. I will not carry this alone." What was whispered to me in the dark would become light in the lives of others. And the final dream came, not to instruct, not to reveal, but to confirm. It was simple: a field, a tree, a bench, and a long line of people, all approaching one by one. Not to ask questions, not to seek miracles, but to rest beside him, to listen, to breathe, to remember their own dreams. And as each sat down, they wept without knowing why, just like Caleb once did, because what was once spoken to him in the silence of sleep had become a song the world didn't know it was hungry for until now. And as the sky darkened around them in the dream, Caleb stood, not as prophet, not as teacher, but as a mirror, and said the only words he now knew with absolute truth. "The same voice that spoke to me is already speaking to you. Don't wait for sleep. Start listening now." The final scroll unfolded like a sunrise. At the top, Dream 15, the completion. What was whispered to you was never meant to stay quiet, and below you were not given the dream to hold it. You were given the dream to become it. What was whispered into your soul was always meant to be spoken through the way you love, the way you pause, the way you stay soft in a world that's forgotten how to hear. He awoke with no urgency, no tears, no questions, only stillness. And in that stillness, there was freedom. He wrote, one last time, Night 15, the completion, what was whispered to me in secret, I now carry in the way I walk. I will not shout it. I will not force it. I will let it live in the spaces where silence still dares to listen. Amen. And somewhere, in a quiet house, somewhere, in a quiet house, someone else turned in their sleep and began to dream, not about symbols, not about stars, but about a man named Caleb who stood in stillness, and reminded them that God still speaks, even now, even in sleep, even in silence, especially in silence. Fim se, Teziar, Pozo, Agora Crier, a disc recal, complete apparel video. No. YouTube, 25 tags, Odamazadas, para SEO, thumbnail.com. Phrase, impactanti, e prompt para imagem. Ilustrada, realista, 45 prompts, symbolicos, para, giracao, d, imagens.com. Midjourney, EA, visual, queer, seguia.com. S's, elementos, claro, aqui, esta, a descrical. Completa, e, envolvente, para o. Video, do YouTube, da Siri.